Hello, everybody. Welcome back for another episode of the Strategy Gap. In today's conversation, we'll have a great conversation on all things navigating turbulent times, building a strategy execution framework, and navigating a career in strategy leadership. Joining us today for this conversation is Larkin Briley. Larkin currently serves as the Assistant Vice President of Strategy and Transformation at Belmont University. There, he spearheads the university's strategic planning framework and many transformational efforts. In his role, he also helps align university initiatives with Belmont's aspirational aim for 2030 and enhances presidential efforts and strategic objectives. He's currently pursuing a PhD in strategic leadership at Belmont and maintains certifications in strategy execution. Interestingly, beyond academia, Larkin embraces an entrepreneurial spirit from founding his own video production company to opening and managing multiple franchises of Chick-fil-A, which Joe and I love very much.
Oh, yeah.
He is also an active community member in Nashville, serving in various nonprofit boards and community engagement efforts. Larkin, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, guys. I'm excited to be here.
Awesome. Well, Larkin, we're planning on getting into a lot during today's conversation. And to kick things off, I wanted to get your take on how turbulent times can impact an organization and really how to build an approach to work through that. Most industries are facing some sort of turbulent times. Sometimes it's a little bit of cliche of a term, but post COVID, whether it's remote work, profitability versus growth at all costs, or some other circumstances, there's a lot that organizations are facing. When we last talked, I really enjoyed learning about the current challenges that higher education are facing over the coming years. And do you mind just kicking off the conversation by talking a bit about what that challenge is for higher education, specifically around the enrollment cliff, and how you're approaching that in your role?
Great question. The enrollment cliff. Yes, the phenomenon called the enrollment cliff, definitely plaguing the minds and hearts of all people who work in higher education right now. If you're not familiar, the enrollment cliff is a phenomenon that's really been driven by declining birth rates in the United States that really started in the 2000s, but accelerated in the 2008 financial crisis. And that's led to a dramatically lower number of traditional college-aged students who will be coming into college readiness in 2025, and that kind of goes to 2030. So a lot of projections. There's lots of different models out there, but a lot of anticipation is that the decline in enrollment is going to be around 15% over the next decade or so, starting next year. And this, I don't know if this happens in other industries, maybe this clearly, where there's a demographic shift, but it's really clear for us. We can't go back and create more 18-year-olds. That's sort of locked in right now. And so we've got 3 or 5 years where we're really looking at our primary sort of quote unquote customer, our traditional college age students that will be entering the college university age years, where we know that's going to decrease sharply and dramatically. And so you add on top of that, there's a report last year from the Higher Education Landscape 2024 survey that, in addition to that, degree of confidence in higher education, the value of a degree is decreasing sharply as well. So that's decreased about 20 to 25% over the last 8 or 10 years. And so, in other words, you've got fewer 18-year-olds, right? And of that pie of 18-year-olds, less of them think that college is a good bet, right? You've got student debt crisis that's looming, and so there's just a lot of disruption. There's a lot of challenge, and so students are looking elsewhere, like non-traditional paths, like technical degrees. You've got employers that are offering on-the-job training, right? Google career certificates. You can get pretty good earning power right out of high school without a college degree. So a lot of people are framing this sort of like a next Netflix moment for higher education, where we're blockbuster in some ways. We see the disruption coming. We know it's happening. We see it. We feel it. And are we going to dig our heels in for the traditional model, or are we going to respond and innovate and be responsive to the needs of the students of the future, right? And this is going to be a big challenge for smaller schools in rural areas. The elite schools that have large endowments and things are going to be a little bit more resilient. But even this week, there are several announcements of closures. And so we're not talking about a light trim of an administrative budget. This is going to require a complete reorientation of holistic strategy for a lot of colleges over the next 5 years. And I don't know what you think the reputation of higher education is, but it's not exactly known for pivoting at lightning speed. So we're going to need to be a lot more strategic in our thinking, and we can talk all about some of the ways that we might think that might be useful. But all this is in service to the mission, right? We want to develop the leaders of purpose and character for the future who want to make the world a better place. And so this is all in an effort to be more sustainable in that impact. And we have to think critically about how we deal with that disruption and turbulence.
It's interesting you mentioned that because the higher education is experiencing issues from a birth rate perspective, and then you have healthcare on the other side of the spectrum that's having the issues with an aging population, which is they have needs that are higher volume, more expensive, and they're tackling with how do we do that with less people coming in the door to then become new payers that are coming in. So it seems like a pretty common trend where people are like, where do we go next? And to your point, how do you then begin that conversation around can't be business as usual. You have to straddle the line between being alarmist, but also being realistic. And have you been able to at least get those conversations going? Because a lot of organizations, you probably can imagine, just stick their head in the ground. They'll say, this will pass. This too shall pass. How have you managed that whole interesting type of conversation?
Yeah, that's a great question, Joe. And quick comment on the healthcare thing. That's exactly right. And there's more of our aging population and less graduating nurses, for example. And 33% of nurses every year are quitting after their first year. Because it's such a difficult profession. And so, as you're saying, it's a huge problem to deal with, and we have to figure out how to engage these problems. And one of the things that we're trying to really think critically through is, there's the Marshall Goldsmith book. What got you here won't get you there. And that's a really important mindset. And it's not one that I think higher education has had to deal with this critically on this level and scale ever before as an industry-wide kind of problem. There's certainly been disruption across different industries and sectors of higher education, but it sort of feels like for us, it's sort of, we need to cross a forest, but there's a thick layer of fog. And maybe the temptation for some folks is just to get a little bit of data. Like, I don't see a tree directly in front of me in the fog, so we're just going to run fast in that direction. And if you're not getting the right type of real-time data to respond, that you're just going to run right into more trees that you didn't see coming. And maybe another temptation is to freeze and go super slow to make sure, okay, in these turbulent times, we need to make sure we don't make mistakes because resources are scarce, and we don't want to make any large bets on things that might not work out. And so I think what we're trying to do is be somewhere in the middle of that, where we're really trying to challenge the existing strategies that we're looking at, start the conversation, and reimagine what a higher education institution can and should be, not only to remain competitive and stay sustainable by kind of keeping the lights on, but to be successful in our mission. This is ultimately, for us, we're a nonprofit private institution, and this is about the mission to help educate and form diverse leaders of character that will help change the world. And volatility, I think, has been written about pretty extensively in business strategy, pretty extensively. You've got all these different models for dealing with uncertainty, with scenario planning and real option analysis, all these things. But I think for us in higher education, we're going to have to be more comfortable with rapid iteration, embracing failure, trying new things quickly, and having the right frameworks that allow for agility to respond quickly to the things that we're learning. And we can talk more about that. Sort of that entrepreneurial mindset is a big piece of what we're trying to embrace. But those frameworks and methodologies for approaching goal setting is something that we're really trying to lean heavily into in terms of our strategy execution that we are rolling out right now.
Yeah, I honestly think that's a great place to go next. And I'll give you a little bit of credit. You're talking about higher education is maybe not having the best reputation for being lightning quick on changes. I don't think that's anything unique to higher education. I think you look at
It's fair.
legacy industries, legacy institutions. It's not only that they've been able to be resilient through these changes, but they also have more people that they need to get on board with the changes, right? It's not just, hey, I'm in a startup and I can make a change that impacts our 30 employees. It's no, we have to impact our alumni, our students, our staff, the community, our future students. There's a lot more that you have to take into account before you can make these transformations. But with that, and knowing all those considerations, knowing the upcoming changes in higher education, I know you're at kind of the cutting edge of taking a new framework for strategy execution. Let's talk about that. What are you doing from a strategy execution standpoint to change the way that you're thinking about strategy in the future of the organization?
Yeah, great question, and one that's really important, I think. And we've over the last couple of years, we have a new president that came in a few years ago, President Greg Jones, and really is an extremely visionary leader who's pushing us to reimagine how we do things. Taking a step away from business as usual, and what is that sort of expanded imagination about the role of an institution of higher learning. And so we developed some things that we knew we needed out of a framework, and we wanted some of the clear things about strategic planning, right? Annual priorities, what's the way we demonstrate alignment and transparency, those kind of things. But we also wanted to lean heavily into this idea of impact over activity and real-time data, where those would be sort of two guiding emphases, sort of cultural signposts to say these are things that we're trying to change the culture a little bit on, because higher education typically can get into sort of a rinse and repeat sort of thing. You get the new students every year. We did this last year. Let's try it again. And so we've sort of landed on an OKR framework, objectives and key results, which I'm sure many of your listeners are familiar with. And a core value of that is sort of pairing a qualitative objective that has some inspiration and aspirational qualities to it, a why sort of, and pairing that with a quantitative measurable outcome or key result to sort of balance that concrete target that you can measure progress against, but also preventing that gamification or box checking, because you're not over indexing on things that don't matter in the system. You're really clear on the why behind it. And we're not just taking exactly what maybe Google or Intel or some of these tech companies are doing. It's a little more challenging to apply to higher education, but we found that this framework, this philosophy that undergirds the OKR framework, is something that we think can be really effective in higher education, and one that we don't see often in strategic planning efforts. Over the last year or so, I think I've probably read like 100 or so strategic plans from other universities, and guys, there's some just absolute doozies out there. Just 150-page documents with 300 people on committees to try to sustain it, and you just get through reading it and you want to just take a shower. It's like, wow, this is so much to take in. I don't even know where to start. And you can even think about being agile with that, because it's such a heavy, overbearing framework to be a part of. And so that's kind of how we've tried to keep it simple and agile, but also get really clear on some of the why.
Yeah, OKRs. I mean, ultimately, we pride ourselves at Achieve It as being methodology agnostic, and it's just like pick a framework that works for you and stick with it. A lot of times when it's like a cafeteria style, where like a little bit of OKRs, a little bit of OGSM, a little bit of this, it just doesn't. There's no rules of the road. So OKRs are fantastic if followed, as well as other methodologies. OKRs are great because there's a scoring mechanism to it, which I think most people would enjoy. The fact that it's not just we accomplished this, how well did we accomplish this? If we accomplish it at 100%, maybe that gives us a 4. And if we are 110%, we really did really well, it's a 5. And that gives people something to strive for. So definitely a fan. So thank you for bringing that up, because a lot of people struggle with like, what should we even start with? OKRs are not a bad place.
Yeah. Just to put a finer point on that, Joe, I think that's an incredible point. And one of the reasons why we're not trying to get too overbearing with what we call it, for us, it's really about our goal setting methodology. We're not trying to, I think even I can get pretty cynical about all the different methodologies. It's sort of like put the alphabet in a blender, and whatever letters come out, just create a goal setting framework. What helps you evaluate where you are, strategize about where you want to be, and measure progress along the way, I think is all that we're trying to do, and be really simple about that. But we do believe, there has been some progress in the research that can show that qualitative piece of the OKR framework is really helpful for organizations that are really connected to their sense of mission and impact, to really tie us forward with that, while also providing the structure for that measurement that you mentioned.
Yeah, because it's interesting, because I guess what I would love to hear from you about is like you get these OKRs in place, and what we're talking about is a fundamental shift in the way that we're delivering what we deliver. And leaders are typically born, at least as we're thought about, working together, shoulder to shoulder on campus, doing things, and that might look like different things going forward. But with the advent of online degrees, or some organizations that are kind of hybrid, where they have a huge online presence, but they also have a physical campus, the question is, can leaders be formed in a remote setting? COVID has kind of explained, at least for my personal experience, we work with our customers, we try to go face to face. The COVID time that we had, we tried to do a lot of that remotely, and not to say that it wasn't effective, it just wasn't as effective. I've done enough. The sample size is large enough for me to say unequivocally that's the case. So how have you had straddled the conversation around like, this is a fundamental precept that maybe we believe in, that we have to get people together, but we're also fighting against people that can sign up and take their classes from anywhere, and that's a very powerful push and pull. Like that's a fundamental phase shift. So how does that conversation sound?
Yeah, it's an incredibly tough balance, right? One of the things that you see a lot of universities doing is going all in on what we call asynchronous online education, which is where you don't have a professor necessarily that's guiding you on a week-to-week basis. You're not meeting all at the same time with any classmates, and And that can certainly be a model that can be helpful for some people. Sort of that, how do you go back and get a certificate in something that can help you? I've done that and it's been beneficial to me. And also, as you mentioned in your introduction, I'm in a PhD program right now. And the learning outcomes, even for myself, even though it's still a mostly online program, are way higher just because I have a group of people to kind of go through that with. And that's something that we're always trying to balance and figure out what are we trying to do to differentiate ourselves. Some of the core components of what we believe like a Belmont education is about is really deeply connected to a sense of purpose and character. And so even when we roll out those online programs, we want to figure out what it looks like for us to differentiate ourselves in the way that we care for those students in a whole person context and really invest heavily, because we know, like you mentioned, emergency use of Zoom does not equal effective online learning. Like, this just totally different thing. And so trying to stay on the forefront and the cutting edge of the best practices of online learning is something that all of our campus is really trying to wrestle heavily with and get real clear about the type of impact that we want to have on those student learning outcomes.
Yeah, I want to go quickly back to what you were mentioning a few times about impact over activity. I think Joe can certainly speak to this as well. What I see a lot in organizations is that they definitely know the activities that they should be doing. A lot of times they even know the goals that they want to accomplish. Where they struggle is, how do we actually connect these two together to understand this is overall the impact that we're trying to drive for the organization. So you mentioned in your organization the qualitative component is important. How do you balance the qualitative with the quantitative and really align everything to be able to drive that impact and make sure that you're doing the right things to get to the proper outcomes?
This is the $1 million question. If I had the perfect answer, this might be a really highly listened to podcast. I don't know if I have the perfect one for you, but the way that we're trying to do it, this idea of impact over activity, for us, the heart behind that is that as an institution that's been around for so long, you can so quickly fall into doing things just because that's the way we've done them in the previous year. We have these projects and initiatives that maybe worked for students really well 10 or 15 years ago. And the students just every year change a little bit more and a little bit more. Then all of a sudden you are dealing with a whole new type of student that needs to be reached and needs to be taught and formed in a totally different way. And the path of least resistance with really busy, passionate professionals is just to kind of do the same thing. And so for us, putting a cultural shift on impact over activity, and I think of culture just sort of what's the embedded DNA of how everyone interacts. That cultural focus of impact over activity is all about trying to shift the focus away from just completing a project or starting and completing a program to directly what is the impact that we can have on a certain stakeholder, whether that's a student, a faculty or staff member, community member that we're partnering with, or otherwise. To do that, we need to get really clear on how we're measuring success. That's really what we think about in terms of impact. What's the measurable outcome of success related to that why behind the goal that we're setting? And sometimes in higher ed, that's really easy. In certain offices, it's a little bit challenging on a university level because it's really like a small city. We've got dining, we've got housing, we've got campus security, we've got learning, we've got all these different administrative offices. And what might work really well to measure progress for fundraising necessarily at a university might work really differently in terms of formation and leadership development, right? So those ways that we provide opportunity, we want to have an open table where people can sort of see, hey, here's all the ways that you might measure success in your area and what might work best for you in your area. But we have to get really clear on not measuring just the warm, fuzzy feelings that we have about completing a project, but what we intended the impact to be. And if we've never measured it before, then we need to establish some baselines about how we get there. So in terms of your question around qualitative and quantitative, for us, we really want to have a number associated with a lot of the things that we're measuring, because that's sort of the pendulum swing for us. We've had a lot of qualitative measurements, at least at our institution, where we've sort of said, hey, we believe that this program has done well because of these anecdotal conversations, and we've done some qualitative surveys and things, but we want to get more clear for us around that quantitative piece. And so that's where the key result, measurable outcome piece, we're trying to get really clear on what that is. And that's going to be an ongoing conversation for us, because how do you measure the generational effects of students who are more resilient and able to participate in civil discourse, right? It's like, how do you how do you even measure an intervention in someone's freshman year on how that affects them 15 years later when they get a promotion at an organization they're part of? It's really difficult, but we're going to be committed to trying to do that because we think it's important to measure the impact.
Yeah, to insert a pop culture reference, I'm a huge Wire fan. So it came out 22 years ago. The show has always been quoted and all these things, but like one that you see constantly, besides Omar, the idea that the old days, they're the old days, and a lot of times, myself included, we are nostalgic for the old days. What we have done is what we should probably continue to do, and it's easy. It's like a warm blanket, and so ultimately, making people realize that the game has changed. It's become slightly more fierce. Let's say we need to rethink our thinking. And the end of the year, we can't sit around and say, "I think we had a good year because look at all the stuff we did." But it's not enough. It's the same evolution that marketing has gone through in the last 20 years. It's in the old days, it's like we're sponsoring a golf tournament. Okay, what's the ROI on that? I don't know. We get our name out there. It's all good. I get a couple free tickets from me and my friends, but like it's not enough. How many leads did you generate? How much revenue have you generated? All that good stuff. Colleges, universities are starting to feel the same thing. If we invest in this project, which meaningful KPI that exists in our world would be impacted, either short term or long term? Have a blend of leading and lagging, but there has to be an answer other than I don't know. And if the answer is I don't know, then we truly shouldn't be doing that thing. And that's sometimes a tough conversation. And we had a recent podcast guest show up and mention the idea of the 4 stages of team formation. And the second one is that the storming phase. And it's all about like figuring out like how to push back on things. And if we're not like pushing back on people in the strategic planning process and say, that's not good enough, that's qualitative. It has to be quantitative. We have to have a measurement. We have to increase, decrease, or maintain something. So please, let's figure out what that is. And like to your point, if we have to get a baseline, that's great. But it being hard is not a reason to not do it. And we have to do it. We only have so much time and energy. So do you give people like a target and like, I need 1 to 3 measurements from yourself? Do you give them something small to start with, like the critical few, and has that then made them more comfortable the next time around? Maybe they'll give you 4 or 5.
Yeah. So the way that we've framed it this year, we're rolling out a brand new methodology this year with our framework, and people are setting kind of their 3 to 5 big rocks, so to speak, their big priorities for each of their units across campus that are aligned to our aspirational aim, which is our strategic plan for 2030. And each of those broad objectives that they have that represent an area of priority will have hopefully 3 to 5 measurable outcomes that represent those key results. And those in our instructions have to contain a number that maintains, increases, or decreases, like you said. So we're on the same page there. And then they sort of come up with a list of initiatives or projects that they think will influence or move the needle on those measurable outcomes, right? And those, what we describe those as, is your best hypothesis for success. And so what we don't want to do is say, lock in your initiatives and your projects for the year and don't deviate no matter what. What we do want to say is if you're trying something out and the data that you're getting back is not moving the needle on that desired outcome, then you need to change course. We need to pilot quickly, learn quickly, iterate quickly, and learn where we're having impact and where we are not, and have the freedom to sunset things that are not having the desired outcome. And so separating out those outcomes or the key results from the initiatives and projects that people are putting in place has been really key for us to distinguish how we're measuring impact and what are sort of the projects initiatives put in place to provide momentum towards that impact.
How do you overcome the stigma potentially of people saying, this idea that I thought was good didn't work out, didn't come out to the way I expected. We're 6 months in, and let's just say it's not going well. That's not something people are like going to like jump up and tell you. Have you had any tips or tricks related to coaxing that type of information out of people, saying we can't let a whole year go by on a project that we knew 4 months in was going to go poorly just because of the stigma attached to it? So have you done anything to break down that stigma, to say like, you bringing it up as an issue is actually something I want to encourage, and I'm going to put you on a pedestal? How's that look?
Yeah, it's a great point to raise, and I think one of the ways that we're going to try to do it is give out some sunset awards. It's kind of a funny way that we think of, how do we highlight and incentivize through recognition the people who have raised their hand and said, "Hey, we tried this thing. It didn't move the needle in the way that we thought we did, or we thought that it did, or we've been doing this thing for 5 years, and we're going to sunset that, and as a team, think about a new way to move the needle on a particular outcome in our area." And try to raise the level of recognition and sort of give those awards out. And maybe we send some cookies or a thank you to them. Say, hey, great job. That is the behavior. That's the type of culture that we want to set, where people are responding to the data in real time. One example will be the FAFSA debacle. I don't know if you're familiar with this right now, but the Department of Education has, to put it kindly, had some challenges rolling out their new FAFSA form, which has delayed the information that incoming students will have about their financial aid by several months. And that's created all sorts of disruption in what we are expecting for enrollment. And the worst thing to happen would be for our student financial services team to just be worried about what that means and to be like, oh gosh, our deposits are down, our admits are down, all these things are down. Let's just hope that it turns out right. Let's keep doing what we've always doing. The best thing for them to happen is to raise their hand and say, hey, we need to bring additional attention. What we're doing has to completely change. So let's try some new strategies. Let's stop what we were doing. Let's do new types of preview days. Let's reach out to students on social media in different ways and create new strategies mid-year to try to have the desired effect on their intended outcome, which would be deposits and ultimately newly enrolled students. And so that's an easy one to think about in terms of enrollment, because it's such an easy thing. Like, we got to pivot no matter what. We got to try to get this outcome. It's harder for more traditional academic programs to think in those ways, particularly because they're not honestly measuring frequently the things that are the outcomes that they have in mind, right? So the completion of a particular program or initiative is usually the thing that they've imagined as success. And so they don't know if they're being successful until that program is done, right? And we want to have more leading indicators, more quantitative feedback, like you've mentioned, that can help us get on board earlier. And so a lot of incentivizing, a lot of trying to recognize behavior at all hands meetings and those kind of things to try to show people, hey, this is the type of behavior that we think is going to help us be successful going forward.
Yeah, this has been fantastic. I feel like we could go on for an hour about this, and maybe 6 months from now we'll check back in and have another conversation about the framework and how it's progressing. But I did want to slightly pivot to one last topic. When we last connected, for the audience listening, Larkin was very modest about the fact that, hey, I'm still learning. I'm new in this role. I'm developing, and I think that's the position a lot of people find themselves in. Is they're in a new role, they're learning. On podcasts or webinars or wherever the case would be, like, you get these experts that have been there and done that, and it's hard to understand, hey, how do I navigate through this journey? So I wanted to get your perspective. You're newer in a senior leadership role in strategy. You spent a lot of time on various strategy roles throughout your career, but what does that transition look like for you, and what advice would you give to other people for navigating through that transition?
It's a great question. I think as I reflect back on my career so far, I'm sort of someone who's worked their way up in the organization and tried to always sort of be known as somebody who could just execute. Like, I want to always be known as the person who's like, I got it, I'll take care of it. That kind of posture. And I love the big ideas. I love the visioning, but I want to be somebody who could really get things done in whatever role I've had on campus. And that served me pretty well, and have the opportunities, like you've mentioned, this past year to step into this new role in strategy execution and strategic planning with just amazing colleagues that I can lean on for that success. But the fact of the matter is, like you mentioned, like I'm on the younger side as a professional. I'm mid-career. I haven't been doing this for 30 years, and so I'm learning on the job, trying to learn as much as I can, doing programs and certifications. But I think the way that I've tried to approach this is to really try to lead by influence and persuasion rather than authority, mainly because I just don't necessarily have the authority on the experience or positionally right now in my career. And funny enough, as I've stepped into this role, I think even if I were to get 25 or 30 years into my career, I would still want to lead this way. I think that's what I've learned is, this idea of authentic or servant leadership, coined by Robert Greenleaf in the 70s, but has really taken on a lot of research in the last few years as it's a very effective framework for embracing empathy and persuasion and commitment to the growth of others. And when I reflect on the best leaders I've been around, they're the ones that have treated me that way and treated their teams. And it's something that I want to continue to guide my work in my own career. So, it can absolutely present some challenging opportunities for persuasion, when you're kind of mid-career and having to lead peers that are much more experienced and senior to you in a lot of ways. But I think that sort of framework of just trying to invite people into how do I help you be successful rather than coming in and telling them what to do, what is the way that I can provide something of value to your experience, to your role, to your leadership, to help you be successful, and maintaining that trust with leaders. We're going to execute well together, but it's all about us working together in partnership. It's something that I would encourage any kind of mid-career professional that's working with colleagues that may or may not be on their sort of organizational level or above. Really get known for executing well, being somebody who brings solutions to the table and not problems, and then trying to lead by persuasion and influence. Building consensus and helping other people be successful rather than trying to come in with your own idea that you think is perfect, but being willing to that sort of designing with teams in mind, and so all of that amidst a great team and leaders above me that look out for me and bring their wealth of experience and wisdom to help guide my efforts as well. I have a lot to learn. I'm excited to learn and implement new things. And it'll be fun, like you mentioned, to see in 6 months where we're at. Maybe you can come back and say, hey, we missed it all. And we had a lot of learning opportunities and growth edges, and we're going to pivot. But hopefully it all goes as well as we hope it will.
The idea of being a piece of the success, not the centerpiece all the time, especially if you're working with subject matter experts that truly are critical to your plan, like letting them celebrate their success at the end of a project and things of that nature. So being a facilitator, and the idea of leaders eat last, right? All the servant leadership stuff that we hear about, there's a lot of real hefty research behind the fact that that's a good way to go, especially if you're managing people at different points in their career. First thing they look at you is with skepticism. So you have to meet them and over prove that you are going to do all the things you mentioned and eventually earn their trust. And once you have it, it's hard to break it. And that's a fantastic bit of advice for our listeners. As we begin to close out the podcast today, we always ask our guests one final question that so creates continuity across all episodes. The question we always ask is, if you can go back in time and speak to yourself as you're going into your career and your new role within strategy, what advice would you give yourself on day one to help you even better in your role?
As I think back, I think one of the things that I would want to be more comfortable with is embracing the right type of failure. When you're young, when you're mid-career, you think you need to do everything perfectly. You got to nail it the first time, and otherwise people are going to throw you out and say, oh, well, he's inexperienced, he's too young, he can't be doing this. But I think as I've learned more and more, there's a great article from a researcher at Harvard Business School, Amy Edmondson, who talks about the spectrum of failure that I think could be a really great read for folks, but kind of talks about like preventable failure, which is like fraud and laziness, like things that you could absolutely prevent. Unavoidable failure, which is sort of the nature of complex systems, COVID and different things that shake up things and cause failure. But she talks about intelligent failure, which is the right type of sort of iteration, embracing learning and failing cheap and quickly and fast, sort of that entrepreneurial thinking and mindset that I think my personality leans a little bit more towards that perfectionism. I think I could have embraced that earlier to sort of be willing to step out and try something new and quickly, learn from it quickly, and be comfortable with it not being in its final state right up front, kind of that beta mode mentality. And I think that would have helped me be a little more successful and quicker to the learning opportunity earlier on, and maybe something that some of the listeners might benefit from as well.
Great, Larkin. Well, we appreciate it. It was a great conversation. I know the listeners will learn a lot from your insights, and we'll definitely be sure to check back in. And I'm confident they'll either be wildly successful, or based on your last answer, you will have learned from those things that were not quite as successful as planned. So Larkin, thanks for joining us on the show.
Thanks so much for having me, guys. This has been a blast.
Thank you.